I don't know how many of you listen each week or occasionally to On Being with Krista Tippett. And her guest today was Devendra Banhart. He's a musician. And they were talking together about Pema Chodron's book, When Things Fall Apart. And I was reminded in that interview today about the Tibetan Buddhist practice of Tonglen. Tonglen, T-O-N-G-L-E-N, Tonglen. And Tonglen in Tibetan means giving and receiving, or rather, receiving and giving, receiving and giving. And it's a spiritual practice. I'd like us to begin our session today with Tonglen. And the idea is, rather than avoiding the suffering in the world, we take it in, we receive it, we turn it around then and send it out as a blessing to the world. We receive the pain and suffering of others and the world. We turn it around and send forth blessing and peace and joy and calm and love to the world. And this is especially good at this time in which if you turn on the news, it can just be overwhelming, right? And by the way, as your pastor, one of your pastors, I would suggest that you not watch the news all the time. Get what you need and then turn it off, because it can just be, it can overwhelm. But another way of handling bad news is to receive it, internalize it, let it affect you, and then turn around and send it out as a blessing to the world. So with your in-breath, you take in suffering, and with your out-breath, send forth peace. Let's try that for just a moment. So I invite you to be comfortable. Breathe in the suffering and pain of others. Breathe out joy, contentment, and love. Breathe in the struggles and hardships and trials of the world. And breathe out peace and calm and love. And continue that on your own for a moment. And now I invite you to breathe in your own discontentment and your own worries and fears. Breathe them in, turn them around, and breathe out joy and calm and peace and love. The presenter today on Being said that he finds a need to practice Tonglen about once an hour, even in good times. And in our more struggling, difficult times right now, maybe that's a practice that can be done even more frequently. Okay, so today we're on part 4, the last part of our series of how to deal with folks who have different views on climate change. And we have a TED Talk by J. Marshall Shepard. Let me introduce you to him. By the way, we welcome Lois Eve Anderson. Lois Eve, I don't know if you can hear us. Can we hear you? We're glad that if you can hear us, we're glad that you're here today. J. Marshall Shepard is about 50 years old. He's a Georgia native. He's a professor at the University of Georgia since 2006. He's an atmospheric scientist, also a meteorologist. Before teaching at the University of Georgia, he worked at the Goddard Space Flight Center for 12 years. He received his BA, MA, and PhD from Florida State. And In 2007, he was the president of the American Meteorological Society. He's also head of the Atmospheric Sciences program at the University of Georgia. And he's going to introduce us to 3 biases that we and our conversation partners have in our conversations. Sometimes they're acknowledged, sometimes they're not, as well as a couple of other aspects that enter into conversations. So as you listen to his TED Talk, I invite you to ask yourself 2 questions. One is, how can this be employed in conversations with people who have different views on climate change? Number 2, is Dr. Shepard talking about the people who are different from us on this issue, or is he talking about us? Or is he talking about both? Ready to go? So, welcome to those who joined us during the TED Talk. We're glad that you're here today. Interested in these 3 biases that he was talking about: confirmation bias, Dunning-Kruger, and cognitive dissonance. Cognitive bias, or rather confirmation bias, is something that everybody's guilty of. In the religious world, it means I've got my mind made up about an issue, and I'm going to the Bible, and I'm going to find a verse in there that supports my point of view. Or I hear a verse and say, aha, you see, that's why I believe in X, Y, Z. And in fact, if you're a religious person and you have a belief about a social issue, you could find, I guarantee you could find some Bible verse to support your viewpoint, no matter what your viewpoint is. It's confirmation bias. Dunning-Kruger, this is, he didn't have a lot of time to spend on it, but I did a little research on it. Maybe you've heard of this before, Dunning-Kruger? That's the idea that we think we know more than we actually know, or we underestimate what we don't know. So we lack a sense of humility when it comes to our own knowledge base. Another way of understanding Dunning-Kruger is that old saying, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. One thing I really love about good scholars is if you see a scholar on a panel and they're asked a question, if they can't answer it, they will tell you, that's really outside my expertise, rather than speculate, because they want to show how smart they are or whatever. A good scholar will say, I think you really need to ask somebody else about that. That's not my field. And that shows the kind of humility that opens up the conversation rather than shuts it down. Cognitive dissonance, his examples were Groundhog Day and the Farmer's Almanac. To tell you the truth, some of you could illuminate this for me. I'm not quite getting what his point is about cognitive dissonance. Is it that we, go ahead, somebody?
Jeffrey, I'll give it a go. Think of it, or another way to say it is, you hold 2 mutually inconsistent points of view at the same time. So,
go ahead.
To go on, or maybe even an example, or even go back to his examples. You ask a scientist about a groundhog. Something you understand is not science. You ask a scientist his opinion about a groundhog. So it's that you hold two very inconsistent views. You know they're inconsistent when they're pointed out, but you hold them anyway.
And this is not exactly a paradox. A paradox is where both things are true, although they appear to be contradictory. These are two things that actually are contradictory.
Yeah, they can't both be true.
Yeah, yeah.
I think these were, can I say something?
Yes, please, Junior.
I think these were things that were important before science. People wanted to have ways of confirming when they were going to plant their crops, what the weather was going to be like. So they looked at the farmer's almanac. That was really all they had in those days. I mean, if you looked at that cover, it said 17 something or other. I mean, it's been around a long time. So before people could rely on science, they looked at that. And that gave them answers. And Groundhog Day, why not? They didn't know any better, so let's have a groundhog come out or not and see its shadow or not and predict what the future is, and isn't that wonderful?
Yeah, I think that's true, Ginny, in the two examples. Those are good points contextually in terms of the two examples he provided, but I think in our conversation about how to have better conversations on climate change, it's important to recognize that cognitive dissonance can play a role both in how we approach the topic as well as how others approach the topic. It is very likely that someone will hold two mutually incompatible or inconsistent points in their head at the same time and may not recognize it.
Yeah, I can give an example of that.
Yes.
It's a person who doesn't believe in evolution but gets a flu shot every year because the flu virus mutates. And if you didn't believe in evolution, you would only need one. But yet they go get one every year, so they actually have two inconsistent ideas at the same time and actually act on them.
Good, thanks. Chuck Frank, you had a comment?
I think that statement was true and accurate. Another good example for weather is that if there's a red flag, and the red flag is the CO2 level rising, and you ignore it and say things are fine, that's a cognitive dissonance. You're ignoring a red flag because you think things are okay. That's two opposing ideas, and they're not consistent.
Good, thanks. Those of you whose faces I cannot see, if you have a comment, please just speak up, or, because I've unmuted everybody, or you can use the chat function also, which should be at the bottom, possibly at the top of your screen. So Dr. Shepard then goes on to talk about, yes,
I had something.
Liz, go ahead. Please, Liz.
I think for me, it's helpful also to think about it, the cognitive dissonance, that even though the word cognitive is there and it is about holding two ideas, I thought the way the meteorologist explained it was helpful because sometimes it's also about acting, right? You're acting consistent with your beliefs, but you might not even realize that you're holding it until you start thinking about it. So he realized he was doing something incompatible, like acting in his forecast in a way that was incompatible with what he knew science to be, or something like that. So it's that your action is somehow inconsistent. And I want to give a real plain world example that's not even like climate or science issue. I have a weird thing about dates and, sort of remembering. And it was a year ago at this group that I announced that I was leaving my job as an attorney to switch. I gave my notice this week a year ago and switched and left and worked for a compost company. And I was feeling real cognitive dissonance in those weeks before I announced to my office that I was leaving, when I knew I was, and yet I was going into the office every day, acting as if I wasn't, and trying to do my best job, but knowing in my heart that something was fundamentally amiss. And it absolutely created cognitive dissonance. I was aware of it at the time. I felt like I was leading two lives. Like, it's that kind of thing. And I think that's another, again, as we approach it and look for it, there's another way to see it.
Thanks. So he concludes his video, his TED Talk, talking about literacy and misinformation. My experience in talking to people with different social views, or scientific views even is that they think I'm the one with the misinformation. Because as one of our presenters, I think it was Michael Montgomery this last month, he pointed out how we get our information from different sources now as Americans. And those who are geared toward a certain viewpoint look at a certain news channel. Those of another viewpoint look at a different news channel, right? So I had a conversation with a neighbor recently about the pandemic. And she gave this kind of predictable, I don't know what you want to call it, virus skeptic, that it's not so bad. And so we all need to get back to work. It's only killing 0.01% of the population. And some of those numbers are inflated. And by the way, it came from China. They released it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I listened and I listened. I was trying to employ what I've learned this month. But then it became clear to me that she's getting her information from a completely different place than I'm getting my information. And she said, you know why I have these views? It's because I'm curious. Everybody else just accepts things that they're told, but I actually look it up and I found this to be true.
Whoa.
So I don't know where you go with those conversations. I'm still seeking my way forward.
Can I, Jeffrey, sorry, real quick. This came up and I'm trying to remember where I heard this, whether it was in one of our conversations or something else, but it was within the last few weeks, that it's when people, it's not even just looking something up. It's sort of like, in terms of sources of information, it's like advertising. People think advertising, you know, it gets conflated. They're told to do something like, oh, well, this must be good for me. And then they feel like new information that might be science-based is conflicting with something they already believed. So it's like, it's not that they're just like looking up something to reinforce what they believe. And again, you can find that anywhere. And it depends on how you pose a question, right? How you phrase a question in a search engine. But it's literally the sources of information. They're like, somebody called it was like pseudoscience-y or science-y sounding or something like that. So it's like, it's giving the appearance or has the gravitas of science-based, but it's not really, but people think it is. And then they find it's confusing and conflicting, but what they're, you know, a lot of it isn't actually science-based, but it's being presented as authoritative in some way.
Mm-hmm. So we only have about 10 minutes left. I want to open it up to you with the two questions I posed at the very beginning. One is taking Dr. Shepard's presentation as a whole, how can it inform the way we would engage people with different views on climate change? And number two, is Dr. Shepard talking about those other people and their confirmation biases and their Dunning-Kruger effect? Or is he talking about us too? Is he talking about everybody's? And if he's talking about us, what's on us then? What's our responsibility? To be aware of our confirmation biases and the perceptions that we bring to a conversation that make us just as difficult to as we think the other person is. Okay, over to you folks.
I think it depends on.
I'm gonna call on Fleur.
I think it depends on your experience. When I was young in the 50s, the school, my parents, church, community, the values all everybody taught the same things. Then I went off to college and I met people some people hated their parents. Some people were not religious at all. And it was my environment, my had expanded. There was another area to think about. And you sort of decide what you yes. Now, this was not necessarily scientific, but I used to think that, you know, if you read it in the newspaper, everybody was presenting facts. Now I know that you read one newspaper, you get one point of view. If you read another one, you get a different one. So you either have to read both and decide, I guess.
Thanks. You're getting some feedback there. I'm not sure. We're still getting some feedback. Aren't we?
Jeffrey, can I suggest that you mute everybody and then call on people with their hands up?
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure why we're having that feedback, friends. I will try to unmute you when you need to speak. Just show me your hand, or you can use the reaction button at the bottom. Thank you, Flurry. This reminded me that years ago, there used to be somebody named Walter Cronkite that we could all tune into on CBS. And he kind of, you know, he just presented the facts. That was back in the day when there were agreed upon facts. And when there was someone with his gravitas and authority, and if Walter said it, it must be true. And today there's no Walter Cronkite. And which brings us back to sort of confirmation bias, that if we want information that agrees with us, we know where to find it. Steve, you look like you're
Yes. Okay. So on that point, the Cronkite point, and going back to your conversation with your neighbor, and what you immediately recognized as a difference in information sources. One of my biases is I believe that there are some information sources that are actively trying to manipulate what a large percentage of the population believes.
Wow.
That it is they are actively working on manipulating belief systems. And I don't, it may be a confirmation bias again. I just don't think that was true when there were 3 networks and I think the focus was different. I think it really was on news and how you presented the news and dealing with facts. So that to me is our biggest challenge, not only on climate change, but on so many things.
Yep.
Chuck Dowding has a comment.
Anybody seen the movie Vice? Raise your
Yes.
hand if you've seen the movie Vice. There's a very chilling section in that movie about the vote to eliminate the fairness doctrine in reporting. That was the day Fox News was born.
Mm-hmm.
And there really was a fairness doctrine that was practiced by the news outlets, and they were deliberately not biased one way or the other. I must say, and this is going to sound really terrible, but I think the New York Times is also somewhat biased in some of the things that it reports. And we need to be aware of the fact that those who watch Fox News think that the New York Times is biased. So thank you.
I saw on NPR this week on their print version on the internet, a story about Plandemic, a video, 20-minute video or something that raises all kinds of questions about where the virus came from, how deadly it is or not, and so forth, and how it's overblown by people who want to make sure that the president is not reelected, and so on, and about a particular researcher whose history is questionable. Have you heard about Plandemic, this video? Have you maybe read the story in NPR? Anyway, my neighbor, I'm sure she's read this and heard about it. But what does it say about other people who don't even know that there is maybe an industry, as Steve is suggesting, that is out there promoting climate skepticism or skepticism about the virus? Maybe it's responsible for people on the right wing to occasionally tune in to MSNBC or CNN. And maybe it's responsible for people on the left wing to occasionally tune in to Fox News, just so that we know what's going through the minds of each other. What do y'all think?
Yeah.
Greg?
Yeah, thanks. I completely agree. Knowing who you're talking to and understanding each other's biases, I guess, because it's hard. It's hard to be a citizen. It's hard to be understood. TV was bad enough, I think, because except maybe PBS, I suppose, from weathermen who are just trying to come out with the most dire predictions just so we tune in, or any television, cable or otherwise, let's say the abortion debate. They want us to think that there's only two things to believe about abortion. You're on the radical left or the radical right. And then if things weren't bad enough with the TV, now the internet and social media, there are no editors even. It's all propaganda, or there's no reason to think it isn't all propaganda. So when you're talking to a person, your neighbor, or posting something on social media, I think the most important thing, and I like what the meteorologist said, his point about speak out. Yes, we all got to speak out, but we've got to make sure that we understand each other, understand where I'm coming from. Yes, you know who I voted for 3 years ago, and I understand who you voted for. But let's get through that, and let's just talk about facts and why you believe what you do and what. It's hard, but I think our duties as citizens have never been more crucial.
Thanks. I'm going to call on Jennifer Guy and then Andrea Anderson. Sure.
Thanks, guys. Loving this conversation. A couple comments, and first of all, about the news. When the news changed from being news to being entertainment, again, talk about an inconsistency. We're watching a program and it's labeled news, and people are saying, "We're now going to tell you the news." They're not. The television is now an entertainment industry. So in order to get the numbers, giving news in a certain way or an impartial way, even PBS, I've had some trouble with Judy Woodruff lately, and I love the gal, but her bias is all over the place. So occasionally, but we are put in such a dilemma about where we get our news. I totally agree with you, Jeffrey, too, about sometimes those of us that are watching one news network need to watch another. But I guess my big question, and I thought the big challenge from the TED Talk today, was expanding our radius. And talking about expanding my radius. Because if someone told me today they've got evidence about that there isn't climate change or evolution in some instances isn't real, I'm here to tell you, I would not believe it. I would not believe it for 1 second. I wouldn't even look at the data because I don't believe it. And if you look at science, you think about the radical Halsted procedure that was once upon a time used for breast cancer patients, and how the evidence was mounting and mounting and mounting that a lumpectomy was fine, a radical mastectomy, bilateral mastectomy was not necessary. It took, I don't know how long, maybe 20 years, 25 years until people believed it. So I guess that's my discouraging thought for the day is I don't know how I can expand my radius, because I have some pretty ingrained beliefs about evolution, about climate change, about the value of birth control and women's reproductive rights, that I don't know if I could be swayed.
Thanks, Jen. Are people okay going just a few more minutes? But if you need to get off the session, that's okay. We're glad that you joined us. Andrea, and then I'm going to read a question from Nancy.
I just wanted to say, on a more uplifting note, Jennifer, I do have a bias, a very favorable bias towards my 94-year-old father, who's still living and not robust, but alive and happy. Anyway, in his late 80s, he was still going to Great Decisions. And so I was down there with him in Oklahoma, and I said, "Okay, Dad, we're going to go." And then the next week he said, we're going to Great Decisions. I said, Dad, we just went to one last week. He said, oh, but that was my conservative group. Now I have to go to the liberal group and hear what they say about the same topic. And I thought that was great.
That's great.
That
Very
is
good.
awesome.
Thanks. There's a question from Nancy Meislan in the chat.
It is from me, even though it says me.
Oh, Nancy, go ahead and just say it yourself.
All right. This is a question for this group. How to put the regulations that minimize the damage of human environmental damage, but also minimize unintended negative consequences. And you may or may not agree with me that a too powerful bureaucracy is an unintended negative consequence. Also, unleveling the playing ground economically between the US and other countries that don't put in environmental regulations.
Thanks, Nancy. Would someone like to address Nancy's question?
Or really just to say, how does this group expand our radius to encompass some of these questions?
Thanks. And if you want to read it, read Nancy's question, it's in the chat area.
Well, what I would say, Nancy, is that we need to be mindful of all the dimensions of the problem and not only be focused on the climate-oriented points. Economic points matter, competitiveness on a global framework, in the global framework matter, but those shouldn't keep us from acknowledging that what the science is telling us and taking robust activity or robust action to try to address that.
I agree.
Yeah, this is Jean. Can I?
Yes, Jean, please.
I was just thinking kind of along those same lines that sometimes I think you have to sort of step away and take more maybe of a teacher or a balcony view to help maybe the other person understand what's going on. So to that point about regulation or decisions that are made that have unintended consequences, just talking about the idea that here are these two opposing thoughts. We need to open the economy, and we don't want people to die right now. Those are opposing things. That's a tension that's out there. And I think to acknowledge it then and engage the other person in, what do you think we should do? Where would you come down on this issue? You can do the same thing with climate change, or we need more regulation, but at the same time, this is going to happen. So where should we use our judgment to set the bar? To try to pull people into that idea that they have an opinion that you want to hear and share. You want them to share.
Jeffrey, you're muted.
Everybody's muted.
I was saying Liz, and then Chuck Frank had a comment.
Oh, sorry, thanks. Jean, I appreciate what you just said, and a lot of this is linking to our previous conversations about this. Jean, to take it even a step further, there's constant tension between the economy and the environment. Like that's something that tension is going to keep going post-virus. So it is something to think about. And then this idea of how do you connect with people with a different viewpoint, those shared values. What do we both care? What do we care about? We care about our local communities, healthy people. Ask questions, like Greg said last week, right? Be open. So instead of going in, and I get you, Jen and Jean, obviously I share these beliefs of this is, how can you struggle? How can you believe what you believe, or what are your sources? But ask what those sources are, try to, ask a question instead of state something, right? Go into it with that kind of openness. And then I'm going to add something to the comments. Jeffrey, it's the Snopes article that I sent you and Steve that will be hopefully part of our pandemic conversation in a couple of weeks, but it's great for this group. It's so Jeffrey can share it maybe with this group, but anyway, it'll be in the comment section for those of you who can, in the chat, sorry, for those of you who can access that easily, and then Jeffrey can share it with others.
Thanks. Chuck Frank, then Chuck Dowding.
One of the issues based on lots of scientific review that I've done if you take a 30,000-foot view of the world from up high, what's changed dramatically is the geometric rise of the population. Small population doesn't affect the environment. So one of the root causes of our problems with CO2 elevation is the tremendous rise of the population. And that's just not sustainable. And there's no animal on this planet that evolves so dominantly and succeeds. So I feel a little pessimistic unless we get the population, the birth issue under control. This is going to be a continuing problem that has a sad consequence.
Thanks. And Chuck D.
Muted.
So has anyone had an experience where they were able to watch Fox News with a Fox News watcher and then get the Fox News watcher to watch PBS with them? Because we all talk about this, but I've never heard anyone who was actually able to do it.
I'll nominate them for the Nobel Peace Prize.
But it's, it's like we all say, well, this is a solution, but it's almost impossible to do that. I mean, so I'm looking for help here.
I think we have to look to an older generation, because I do think that the greatest generation, I don't know, maybe they were appropriately humbled, or maybe they just have a lot more wisdom than we do at our junior senior states. But I don't know. I use my dad as an example, because I go down in Oklahoma. It seems like everybody only watches Fox News. I'm like, Dad. So we watch the other and we'll talk about it. He hates it all, but for some reason he's glued to it. I mean, don't watch TV so much, Dad.
I'm going to call on Paul in a moment. I like being called a junior senior. Finally,
Yeah.
no, I have a label for myself. Thank you.
Yeah, we're junior seniors.
Paul?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that WGN, if you weren't aware of this, their national network is going to hold a 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock news show every night, and they promise that it will not be prejudiced one way or the other. Only going to deal with the facts. Now, what are the chances that's going to last? I don't know, but you might want to. I think it's in the next couple of weeks they're going to start doing it, so you might want to check it out and get your friends on either side to check it out.
Okay.
The only caution I would offer to that, Paul, is if you look at the ownership and look at what they've done with their local stations around the country, there's a very strong conservative bias.
So you're not going to give them a shot?
No, I think I will, because I want to see WGN survive. You know, I like what they do overall, so I'd like it to be successful.
Yeah,
but
I know what you're saying, and I'm aware of that, but it's worth a shot.
So yeah, I come in with a conservative bias, confirmation bias, I'm sorry.
The very final word will come from Flurry Lynn, and I do want to point out that Liz posted that Snopes.com link in the chat room area, so you can look at it there. So actually, I'd like to give the last word today to Charles Darwin. Remember him? And Dunning-Kruger didn't come out till 1999, but really Charles Darwin knew all about it way back in the, 2 centuries ago. He wrote, "Ignorance frequently begets confidence."
Perfect.
So I'll see you all at church service in about 20 minutes, and bless you all today and this week. See you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Bye, everyone.
Everybody.